Hi everybody, it's Josh Wagner, and today I'm wondering about pleasure. So this is Wondering to Work, the podcast I shoot in my car on the way to work, and there's no traffic, so I started the podcast. Anyway, I know people are concerned about that sometimes, but the last episode I talked about pain. I talked about pain not necessarily being a bad thing. Well, I kind of want to do the corollary episode and talk about pleasure. Because, like everybody else, I love pleasure. Who doesn't love pleasure? And pleasure's there for a reason. I mean, we're built for it. We have all these sensitivities that make things pleasant. Things that taste good, things that feel good, things that sound good. Good music, good food, good relationships, sexuality. All of these things are designed to make us feel good. It's one of the reasons we do what we do, is to feel good about things. And pleasure's a good thing. I remember once I was on a trip with some college buddies, and we were traveling through France, and we stopped at this restaurant in Paris. And to this day, I can still remember eating the food there. And I remember the whole setting was so fantastic. I was there with some of the people that I love the most in the world. It was in this beautiful little restaurant. The couple that ran it was so nice. The food, I remember the taste of the food as it went into my mouth and filled my whole head with flavor. It was one of the most pleasant experiences of my whole life. And I would love to figure out some way to relive all that, except the experience itself is pleasant to recall. Just even as I'm driving to work here and recalling the friends, I don't remember the conversation, but I remember the experience, and it was so fantastic. It was so wonderful. And I think that if I had that experience every day, that pleasure every single day, that it wouldn't have meant as much to me. Now, again, I love pleasure just like everybody else. I like feeling good. I like doing things that make me feel good. But there's these moments in our life in which it's just overwhelmingly pleasant, and it's because those are unique experiences that they lodge themselves into our minds. But pleasure can, of course, take a wrong turn. It can go too far and turn into numbing. That we do things that feel good or sound good or taste good or whatever because we're using it as a way to sort of ignore a real problem. It's sort of like when, I just thought of this as I'm driving. It's sort of like when my car starts to make a noise, I turn the radio up so I don't have to hear the noise. I did that several weeks ago. Like, my car started making a noise, and I'm like, I don't really want to hear that. So I turned my radio up, or I turned the course up that I was listening to, or whatever it was. And I used that sort of pleasant thing to ignore something that was going on. And we can do the very same thing when it comes to pleasure. We can use pleasure to ignore problems that are going on because, well, if I feel good about it, maybe the problem won't happen. And of course, problems will outpace pleasure in the long run. You're eventually going to have to get that sound checked out in your car. You can't play your music loud enough to make your car go when it's stuck in the side of the road, right? And there's no amount of pleasure that's going to fix that. So when I was in school, when I was in philosophy, in college, I have a degree in philosophy because that's, fast cars and money. I remember studying the hedonics, those who were into hedonism. That's what they called it. The Greek word for pleasure is probably some related word to hedonos or something like that. And Epicurus was, I believe, the father of hedonism. And of course, when we hear hedonism, we think of a couple things. One is a resort in Mexico called Hedonism, which of course is about, romping around and doing all sorts of stuff. But we also think of, it's a negative term. Someone who's depressed is anhedonic. That is, they can't find pleasure in anything. And when you think about the Epicureans, or the hedonists as they were called, you think that they were probably just these guys that caroused and drank and partied and all this kind of stuff. And it's a really much more complex philosophy than that. Hedonism, in the sense of Epicurus, was very much about not just the pursuit of pleasure, but the avoidance of pain. And not in the sense that we talked about last week. I don't think that hedonists would have totally dismissed pain as a bad thing. But for hedonists, it was also about balance of not having too much pleasure, because too much pleasure actually causes pain. Like, I love German food. We have this great German restaurant here in town called Schmidt's, and I love it. It's great. And we have Hofbrauhaus too, and sometimes I go there. But if I were to eat that every day, first of all, I get sick of it. Second of all, I would be like 9,000 pounds. I would be dead. Too much pleasure actually equals pain. So one of the pleasures of the hedonist, of the Epicurean hedonist, was to find a balance in your life. And some of the pleasures that they talked about, that Epicurus talked about, as I recall, it's been a while since I've read it, but I remember it very well, because it was sort of backwards from what I expected, was to have good relationships and to have good experiences and to have memorable ones, and not to just pursue pleasure for itself, but to avoid the pain of too much pleasure, to avoid the pain of taking advantage of somebody, to avoid the pain of doing things without more depth. And the real pleasure for the Epicureans was to have a sort of important depth to whatever they did. So that's the real pleasure. The real pleasure was the depth, the importance, the profoundness, the import of the things that they were doing. And not just this sort of mindless pursuit of pleasure. It was the pleasure of having goodness and balance and avoiding just the pain of excess. So they were really pretty good guys. It was an interesting set of philosophy, and of course we hear hedonism right now, and we think it's a bad word. Of course, in our culture it is a bad word, but in some sense it's a really good thing to enjoy life. You're allowed to enjoy, and there's so many people that don't enjoy their life because they choose to be unhappy, or they think it's wrong. They think that it's not okay to enjoy like pleasure, somehow this awful thing, that if I'm having pleasure, that means I'm not doing something right. Well, it's perfect. We're perfectly designed for that. So eat cherries and enjoy ice cream to the point where it's pleasant and not in excess, and understand that it's okay, even in the middle of a painful time of your life, to find some kind of pleasure, to give yourself a break, as long as it doesn't become a substitute for dealing with the actual problem. And I can tell you again that, selective pleasure, understanding that pleasure in its particularly good context is a fantastic thing. And one of my favorite days is that day that I was in that restaurant with my friends in Paris. And I had a few other days like that in my life that are just so wonderful and so memorable and so good and so pleasant, even just to recall. We can talk about this in another podcast, but experiences are way more important than having things. And you can take pleasure in things too. You can have things in your life that are good and pleasant, as long as they don't, control and consume your life. I think it's a really great thing to have. So that's my reflection on pleasure. I was kind of wondering about pleasure since I did the one on pain last week, so I'll link it in the description to last week's episode if you want. You can find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, at Wondering to Work, all those different places. And I guess I prefer Facebook to all of them, that just have a bigger following there. But I'm posting to everything, except for maybe Twitter. But I'd love to hear what you think about this. I'd love to hear what you think about the pleasure principle here, and sort of the context that I put it in, which is a very Epicurean, and I love saying that because it makes me sound really, really much smarter than I am, Epicurean context of pleasure being a good thing, but also only in balance and not in excess. All right, I just got off of my exit. See you later. Bye.